Thank you very much. I just want to be the bearer of a bit of good news following on Leo's talk. He mentioned a report to be voted next week in the European Parliament, the Estrella report on sexual and reproductive health and rights, which includes demands for a human right to abortion and so on. If you are contacting your member of the European Parliament, you tell them to vote for Amendment 1. Because Amendment 1, if it is voted for, will replace Mrs. Estrella's report with a good report that says the right thing written by our friends in the European Parliament. So that's what should happen. Thank you. I introduced myself at the beginning as President of the European Christian Political Foundation, but that is only an honorary role. My day job is as representative in Brussels of a Christian NGO called Care for Europe. And CARE stands for Christian Action, Research and Education. CARE actually started in the United Kingdom back in the early 1970s. It started as a movement. It wasn't sort of organised to begin with, which got christened by a Christian, ex-atheist Christian journalist of the time, Malcolm Muggeridge, as the Nationwide Festival of Light. It wasn't long after we'd had a law passed legalising abortion, a law passed making divorce much more easier, and we recognised as Christians that something was going wrong, that instead of the traditional basis of English law in the values of Christianity and the Bible, the Ten Commandments, we were being taken in a different direction. And this movement wanted to give a voice to those who said there should be a warning to the nation, that there would be consequences of following this route, that society would suffer, there would be breakdown in families and so on, which are all the things that Leo has described, which has actually happened. It was a movement which brought people to the streets. We ended up with a rally in Trafalgar Square in the centre of London, which was at that time the largest open-air gathering of Christians in the history of England. We formed this NGO, Care for Europe, out of Christian Action, Research and Education from that, and in the early 1990s we opened an office in Brussels. Why did we open an office in Brussels? Because we recognised that after the Single European Act and the Maastricht Treaty, the European community, as it then was no longer dealing just in economics. It was dealing in politics and in social policy. And if we wanted to continue influencing government policy and laws in the United Kingdom, we had first to influence what happened in Brussels, because such a large percentage of our laws which affect the areas with which we are concerned are actually decided first in Brussels or in Strasbourg by a European directive, and that sets the principles, the framework. The National Parliament just puts a few details on. It is just managing, as Leo said. So we established a presence in Brussels so that the Christian voice could be heard there as well. And we also have special consultative status at the United Nations, because they are all part of this global movement. And we have a twofold mission, we say. The first is proclaiming Christian truth, ensuring that the Christian voice is heard in the public square, in parliaments nationally and in international organisations, and promoting biblical ethical standards, but also demonstrating Christ's compassion by developing a network of caring services, aiding those who are suffering from society's departure from Christian ethics. And in our history, we developed an adoption and fostering agency as an alternative to abortion. We've developed the largest network of crisis pregnancy counselling centres in the United Kingdom, where women can come and have help and advice and somebody who will get alongside them and support them in making their decision and let them know the alternatives, and so on. I'll skip through quickly, and it's our job and my job, particularly in Brussels, to campaign for Christian ethical standards in the area of medical ethics and bioethics, the primacy of the right to life, marriage and family life, favouring stable nurturing. We must always have a positive slogan, not just be against what our enemies say. And all the evidence, if you go into social science studies and so on, makes very clear that children prosper best, have the best outcomes later in adult life if they have a stable two-parent home. That's not to say that we want to discriminate against single parents and those through misfortune who've ended up in that state. But it cannot be in the interest of society for government to actively promote that sort of relationship as a model for others to follow. And child protection. We're particularly concerned that childhood is being infringed by modern society and the values that Leo has been talking about, and we want children to be protected from commercial exploitation and pressure at a young age, and also from visual media content, traditionally on television, but now more and more on the internet. And we have succeeded in persuading our Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, which we're very happy about, that the basis for internet connection will be changed, and the internet service providers in the United Kingdom have agreed that internet connection software will be sold, will be given with child protection filtering built in from the start. Those who receive it can then later, if they want, get access to adult programs and content by proving their age. But the norm will be that it arrives with protection. And also, you may be interested to know, the government of Iceland and their parliament have legislated to make that the law of the land in Iceland as well. And human trafficking, the greatest assault on human dignity that we face, modern-day slavery. We campaign for better support for victims and more effective action against the perpetrators, and help to raise awareness, particularly in the southeast of Europe, which unfortunately is an origin country for many of those who are trafficked into the West, and particularly into prostitution. And we also advocate for a particular approach to prostitution policy, because it is countries where prostitution is most liberalised and legalised where there is the greatest trafficking of women into those countries from abroad. Where there is a significant increase in demand, basically when you make prostitution normal and you take away the social inhibitions, you get a much greater increase in demand for prostitution, and by and large the ordinary inhabitants of countries like England or France or Germany don't easily volunteer for prostitution. It's those foreigners who come in who meet that demand. And our role in Brussels is twofold: monitoring upcoming European policy and law proposals, and alerting our HQ and our supporters and the whole ECPF network and other NGOs in Brussels that are sympathetic of what's coming, and formulating a Christian response in relation with the liaison with our CARE headquarters. And then we lobby individual European Commission officials, because that's where European laws start to be drafted. Members of the European Parliament individually and in groups, political groups and committees, drafting briefing papers, addressing public hearings which happen before new laws, usually before they are adopted by the Commission or before they are passed in Parliament. You can go along as an expert witness to give your view, or if you don't get that, to speak from the audience, and drafting and lobbying for amendments to change these proposals, as the amendment I'm talking about next week in the Estrella report. But if we are to influence the European institutions, we need to understand how they function. It is a body, the European Union, unlike any other, sui generis, as the lawyers say. It is not an international institution, it is an intranational institution. All other international institutions, like the UN or the Council of Europe, they draft treaties, and individual member states have to, or conventions have to, sign and ratify them, and not everybody does, and those that don't aren't affected by them, by and large. In the European Union now we have majority voting, and what is agreed by the Parliament and the Council becomes the law of the land of every member state. They have decided to pool sovereignty, which is supposed to be limited to certain issues and certain powers, but that can be mucked around with by our enemies, but we'll come back to that. What is the legislative process? Well, firstly, the European Council, otherwise known as the European Summit, the heads of state and government, they are the ones who set the agenda They are the stakeholders of the club. They finance the European Union. And it is supposed to be that proposals only happen if they want them. Sometimes, however, they're not very diligent and observant, and things are sneaked past them. They allow them to happen without having read the small print and without having civil servants who advise them, because quite often the civil servants have been captured by this new liberal, progressive, relativistic tendency. And you get a symptom which sadly is reflected of many countries, where their representation office in Brussels, their embassy in Brussels to the EU, gradually comes to adopt this global ethics culture and doesn't always do what the government and the politicians back home would want them to do. And they have ways of defeating that. So we have to go back to the member states and make sure that the ministry back home gives the instructions to the EU representation and they do what the ministry wants. Religious liberty is a very important issue for us. It's not a word that is off our agenda. Sadly, it's one we've had to deal with more and more. When I first took up this job 12 years ago, as far as the European Union was concerned, we didn't used to worry about religious liberty. I mean, after all, it was there in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It was something that had improved in countries that came into membership of the European Union and was continually improving in those that wanted to become members of the European Union. I had a friend back in the 1990s who was a sort of Christian undercover missionary, I think you would call him, in Turkey at the time. But whenever he was arrested, the British ambassador only had to come along and say, if you do this sort of thing, you will never join the EU, and he was released again. And I say these freedom rights are enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, incorporated into the Lisbon Treaty. But the Charter has no hierarchy of rights. And what is happening, and Leo touched on this in the area of freedom of conscience being lost, promotion of hate speech and anti-discrimination laws, in fact, this religious liberty is being taken away. And whenever there is a fight between religious liberty and gay rights or rights of other religions, then they tend to win in these fights. At the moment, it's not yet a done deal at the European level. There's a particular piece of legislation proposed by the Commission back in 2008 called the Equal Treatment Directive, which has been blocked in the Council of Ministers ever since, and I sincerely hope will be ditched when the parliamentary elections for the European Parliament come up next year. It has been blocked because enough member states says no, this was going too far. But unfortunately, in the north of Europe, in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, in the United Kingdom, the national governments have actually gone further than Europe and have implemented these sort of provisions. And Christians are increasingly finding themselves in court. And it is their liberty that we are seeking to defend. Their liberty of conscience, not to have to perform gay marriages, not to have to perform abortions. Their liberty of speech, to be able to explain the teaching of the Bible and the theology of their religion and not be jailed and taken to court because of it. Their liberty when the church is providing social aid to do it according to Christian principles. We have the terrible situation in England that all the Catholic adoption agencies have had to close because they would not agree in advance to place children for adoption with gay couples. And that whole work, which was dealing with some of the most difficult children put up for adoption, who'd had very, very damaged early childhoods, was just closed and taken away. Recent developments, and much of this, I'm afraid, is just a summary of what Leo had to say earlier, the mindset of the elite and of the most well-funded and well-staffed NGOs. Leo asked the question, I will answer it. The International Gay and Lesbian Association European branch is jointly funded by the European Commission and the George Soros Foundation. They're not funded by subscriptions from their members, of which they have very few. This new and ethical agenda is being promoted on the basis, not on the basis of reason or evidence, but of ideology. As Leo said, when we go to talk to MEPs, we don't quote the Bible, we give them the evidence of which form of family and marriage gives the best outcomes for society in terms of children growing up to be healthy, active citizens, and that therefore should be promoted by the authorities. The evidence that abortion is never a good solution. Both women who have an abortion and those who are thinking about it. I think the microphone has stopped. Yes, can you still hear me? Okay. Oh, it's working again now, I think. It's obviously got a loose connection somewhere. I was saying that we work on the basis of evidence. Our opponents work on the basis of ideology. They do not want to be confronted by the facts. The rise in abortion and teenage pregnancy, they advocate the answer to that is more permissive sexual education at an ever younger age and abortion and contraception free and on demand. In fact, when we give evidence that the countries that follow that policy have the highest rates of abortion and teenage pregnancy, they don't want to hear. They took a few years ago the government of Croatia to a European court. They said that their sex education policy, which was being provided at the vote of parents by a Christian NGO, was taking away the rights of these children. And can you believe it? They said it was a form of child abuse. It was endangering the health and the welfare of children that they had sex education which encouraged responsibility and marriage and so on. They took their case to this European court and said that Croatia should be forced to change its law. Before they did that, they sent a letter to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health in the government of Croatia. They did it on headed notepaper from the European Parliament and said that the European Parliament working group on reproduction and sexual and reproductive health and so on told them that they had to change their law. They gave no indication that this group was entirely self-appointed group of a small number of MEPs. We got a letter from the President of the European Parliament telling exactly that this group had no status, it was not official, it did not speak on behalf of Parliament, which we were then able to send to the authorities in Croatia. But coming back to this European court hearing, the defence of the Croatian government gave evidence of the statistics in their country for abortion, for teenage pregnancy, for sexually transmitted diseases, which showed that their country had well below the European average of the incidence of these problems. And the European Court decided, you have the best policy because it's having the best results, and dismissed the case by our enemies. And the favourite method of promoting ethical change is through asserting rights which haven't previously been recognised and forcing those not in agreement onto the defensive. And we always have to find a positive strategy in retaliation based on evidence. Human rights started off as a Christian project. If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it emphasises marriage and family as between one man and one woman, the right of parents to have the prior role in the education of their children according to their own beliefs and convictions and so on. But now, everything focuses on the autonomous individual, even as was said earlier for children. They want children in primary school to be taught about their sexual rights, to start experimenting. Sex with the other sex or sex with the same sex, all are the same. The emerging trends, anti-discrimination. We've gone from tolerance to affirmation, as Leo said. The classic definition of tolerance was from Voltaire the French philosopher. He said, "I absolutely disagree with what you have to say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it." But we are now faced with a lobby which says something totally different. They say to have tolerance and respect, you have to agree with and affirm the opinion of the other person. You're not allowed to publicly disagree. When, a few years ago, the Italian nomination for Commissioner of the European Commission, Rocco Buttiglione, was being questioned by committees in the European Parliament, which was a very, very difficult time. I'm not one that goes overboard on spiritual warfare and demons and all the rest of it, but I certainly felt a spirit of oppression and evil power with what was going on then. And what was said many times, both openly and privately, we don't mind if he has these views, we just mustn't talk about them. Fortunately, a few years later, when the Maltese government put up Tonio Borg to be a European Commissioner, and the very same attacks were made against him by the same lobbies as were made against Mr. Buttiglione, we were able to rally the opposition to him and to win the day. And we put it in their terms. Vacancy for a European Commissioner, Christians need not apply. We said this was a clear case of discrimination against Christians, and it should not be followed. Hate speech, anti-hate speech and incitement, the loss of freedom of speech. It is almost routine now in the United Kingdom for street preachers to get arrested by the police, even though what they are doing is totally legal. There is a clause in the relevant Act of Parliament which we got in there and defended against government opposition that says that explaining the sexual morality of your religion is not hate speech. So why are people being arrested? They are being arrested because the police have been trained in the implementation of this law by gay lobby groups, and they conveniently forget to mention this particular part of the law. Loss of conscience rights through employment and service discrimination laws. We've already touched on that. The right of conscience is very important, both for Christian employers and for Christian employees. We have the ridiculous situation of photographers being prosecuted for refusing to take photographs of a gay wedding, in inverted commas, in a country where gay marriage wasn't even legal. But the Anti-Discrimination Commission decided that this was wrong. And reproductive rights. Well, I won't dwell on that. We've talked on that before. There is this whole process of trying to assert a right that does not exist to abortion on demand. If you need evidence, there is a document you can find on the internet called the San Jose Articles. San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica. And that makes very clear that no agreed international instrument, democratically agreed international instrument, requires a right to abortion. It is only being asserted by well-funded lobby groups. And now we also have this campaign for a right to die. What does all this mean? Christians must wake up to what is going on. We cannot be convinced by pietism to remain within the walls of our churches and only talk about the Bible or preach the gospel within our church walls. We must be out being the salt and light in our society that Jesus told us that we should be. We have only ourselves to blame for what has happened. As one of the early American thinkers in their liberations struggle said, the only thing that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And that is what has been happening in our countries. Not so much in Hungary, thank God, but certainly in the north and west of Europe. And Christian politicians, of which we need many more, must be prepared to be unpopular and insulted for Christ's sake. We continually get these labels: anti-choice, extremist, fundamentalist. It just goes with the territory. And it is the favourite tactic of our enemies to find a label which is insulting to put on us, rather than to have a rational argument. I mean, like this word homophobia. They will just apply it to any reasoned argument which doesn't accord with their particular agenda. And it's very amiss of them to do this. The gay community, as they call themselves, have fought for years for their condition not to be classed as a medical disorder. Now they are using a label for us, which is like a medical disorder, an irrational fear, a phobia. And the church must get behind those speaking up for Christian values in public life. Too often, the church only reveres those who are priests or who are missionaries, maybe, if you're lucky, doctors and nurses and people in the caring professions. But we need to honour those within our congregations who are holding down high office and who are campaigning for Christian values in public life. They need more pastoral support, and they definitely need prayer backing. Lessons from Army life. This is my last sequence of slides. I grew up in the aftermath of the last World War, when virtually every male adult had been in the army, and when talking in military terms was a commonplace. Now it's become some sort of taboo. Fortunately, in England, we're going back to some sort of respect for our armed forces, but there was a while when they just were not recognised and were denigrated. The pincer movement. We need a mass movement on the ground, and we need select professional lobbying. Faith and works need to go together. So, when I am going into an MEP's office in Brussels, what is music to my ears is when I bring up a subject and he says, "Oh, I'm so glad you've come to see me, David. I'm worried about this. I've had letters from my constituents. I've had calls. And I want to find a way of meeting what they want because I want to get re-elected." They are elected people. So often they think that what they do in Brussels is invisible to back home. And sadly, the national media of many countries aid and abet that by just not reporting what is going on in the European institutions. They need to be held to account, and there need to be active citizens in every country. And there are many movements like my foundation that can give you the information to help you to do this. And we also provide training courses in doing this. There needs to be the Christian voice in each state talking to their members of parliament, talking to their government. And when European law proposals come up saying, you must vote against this in the Council of Ministers, you must vote against this in the European Parliament, I'm giving the reasons why. Co-belligerency. My enemy's enemy is my friend. Although, as was said earlier, the vast majority of the population of nearly every European country self-identify themselves as Christians, we cannot succeed by the Christian voice alone. We have to bring in other people of goodwill, particularly those of the other monotheistic religions, the Muslims and the Jews. We may have differences with them on other issues, but on these fundamental human values issues, they can be our allies. They certainly are at the United Nations. Also on certain issues, those who are against us on things like reproductive rights can be for us when we talk about the plight of prostitutes and something to be done to stop the exploitation of women in this field. Leo and I actually went to see the European Women's Lobby in Brussels, which is the European Commission-funded NGO which lobbies for the most extreme feminist rights. But they also lobby for prostitution to be better controlled through having an offence, basically for the men who use prostitutes to be made the criminals and for the prostitutes to be rescued from that situation. Using the secret weapon, don't go beyond what can effectively be prayed for. This is a part from the liberation of the Promised Land in the book of Exodus, chapter 17. The Israelites were fighting the Amalekites, And Moses was sitting on the top of the mountain praying for them. And as was the Old Testament habit, he lifted up his hands in prayer, his arms in prayer to pray. But he was old and he was tired and he couldn't keep them up for long. And when he had to put his arms down, the enemy started winning. And then when he put his hands up again, the Israelites started winning. So they put a stone under him to sit on, and Aaron and Hur came and joined him and propped up both arms so that Israel won the day. I'm very conscious that I cannot do and I cannot succeed in what I'm doing in Brussels without an army of people behind me who pray for me. I got a call yesterday when I got off the plane at the airport here from a man who coordinates a whole European network of prayer groups. It's called the European Union of Prayer. And he'd heard about the Estrella report that's going to be voted next week. And he asked me for something that he could put in a message to give out to all his people who pray. And I very much thank God for that. Coordination is the key. The European, the national political level have to be linked together. You mustn't miss out one or the other. They both have their rights, which must be respected. And only a two-way flow of information and strategy coordination can win. I named this talk Influencing Europe. I know in Hungary you have felt in the last 3 years that you have been under a volley of fire from the enemy, which is Europe trying to influence you to conform to a certain pattern. It can work the other way. We can also influence Europe through the institutions to which there is democratic access, and we must do that. Therefore, membership of networks, whether political parties or NGOs with shared values, is essential. So we're obviously very happy that both the Barankovics Foundation and the Alliance of Hungarian Christian Intellectuals have joined our movement and will be able to work with us and have worked with us in this conference today. Thank you very much.
Mr. David Fieldsend, Care for Europe and Chairman of ECPF. We are very happy to you accepted our invitation. What do you think about in Middle East Europe? Which Christian values are important in the public policies?
Well, the Christian values which are being enshrined in the current Hungarian constitution. And as I said when I started the conference this morning, I very much am happy to be in Europe because I see Hungary as a nation that is leading the way in Europe in renewing society and the nation on the basis of Christian principles. So the fundamental principle of human dignity, the worth of every individual on an equal basis, but also the importance of marriage based on the marriage between one man and one woman, and family life springing from that down the generations. We need to have societies which are strong at their foundations. The foundation of societies are family, church, community. The state only exists to help them. It should not be trying to supplant them. And unfortunately, in other countries and other places, there are forces which are undermining the family and intruding the state into areas which should properly be the domain of family or of church.